"She's with catering," my husband said, without even looking at me. And in that moment, something inside me went completely still. I had spent 2 hours getting ready for that night, standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom, carefully smoothing the navy silk dress he once said made me look elegant, the one I had saved for special occasions, the kind that used to matter. At 68, I no longer tried to impress anyone. But this was his company's biggest annual gala, and for 42 years, I had stood beside him at events just like this, not as decoration, but as his partner. The ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, glasses clinked, laughter floated through the air, and yet, as I stepped past the entrance, guided by a polite but confused hostess, I felt like I had walked into a room where I no longer existed. No one greeted me. No one said my name. I recognized faces, people who had sat at our dinner table, people who had sent Christmas cards addressed to both of us. But their eyes slid past me like I was part of the wallpaper. I told myself it was just the crowd, just the noise, just the chaos of a busy evening. But then I noticed the seating chart. His name was there, printed in bold letters at the center table. Mine wasn't anywhere. Not misspelled, not misplaced, just missing. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, long enough for a young assistant to approach me with a tight smile and ask if I needed help finding the service area. I thanked her softly and walked away before my voice could betray me. Across the room, Richard was already surrounded by colleagues, laughing in that easy, practiced way, his hand resting confidently on the shoulder of a woman I had never seen before. He looked comfortable, at home, as if nothing was out of place, as if I had never belonged there to begin with. I found a quiet corner near the back, close enough to hear the music but far enough to disappear, and I folded my hands in front of me, the way I used to when I was trying to be patient with our son as a child. I watched the room instead of participating in it, noticing details I might have once overlooked, the way people leaned in when they spoke to him, the way his eyes scanned the room but never once landed on me, the way my presence had been erased not with cruelty, but with something colder, indifference. And that was when I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I hadn't been forgotten tonight. I had been intentionally left out. I stayed in that corner longer than I expected, not because I wanted to, but because I needed a moment to understand what I was feeling, and it was not anger, not yet. It was something quieter, something colder, like realizing you have been speaking in a room for years and only now noticing no one ever answered. A server passed by with a tray of champagne glasses and offered me one without hesitation. The same polite smile, the same assumption, and I accepted it without correcting him, because for the first time that evening, it felt easier to let them believe I belonged to the background. I took a small sip and let my eyes move across the room again, slower this time, more deliberate. I noticed how Richard leaned in when he spoke to that woman, how he introduced her to others with a slight gesture of his hand, confident, practiced, almost rehearsed. I noticed how people nodded, how they listened, how they laughed at the right moments, and I tried to remember when he had last looked at me that way. It had not been sudden, I realized. It had not started tonight. It had been happening in small, quiet ways for years. The missed introductions at smaller dinners. The way he would speak over me when I tried to add something to a conversation. The gentle, almost apologetic way he would say, "Margaret prefers to keep things simple," as if I had chosen to fade into the background. I had told myself it was nothing, that it was age, or fatigue, or just the way long marriages settle into silence. But standing there, watching him move through that room as if he were alone, I understood that it had never been about comfort. It had been about convenience. A group of younger employees walked past me, their voices low but not low enough. "I thought he was married," one of them said. "Maybe she could not make it," another replied. "Or maybe he does not bring her to events." Like this. I felt the words land, not like a blow, but like confirmation. I turned slightly, just enough to see my reflection in the mirrored panel behind the bar. The woman looking back at me did not look out of place. Her posture was straight. Her dress was elegant. Her hair, silver and neatly styled, caught the light just enough to soften her features. There was nothing about her that needed to be hidden. And yet, here I was. I set the untouched champagne glass down on a nearby table and smoothed my hands over the fabric of my dress, a small, grounding motion. I did not belong to this corner. I had never belonged to the background. For decades, I had helped build the life that allowed him to stand at the center of that room. I had hosted dinners, remembered names, supported decisions, carried responsibilities that no one there would ever see. And now, I was being edited out of the final picture. I felt a shift then, subtle but unmistakable. Not a surge of emotion, not a dramatic realization, but a quiet decision forming beneath everything else. I would not ask to be seen. I would not walk across that room and remind him who I was. If I had to choose between being ignored and walking away with my dignity intact, I knew which one I would choose. I took a step back, then another, moving toward the exit with the same calm expression I had worn all evening. And as I reached for my coat, I allowed myself one final glance at the man I had spent most of my life beside. He did not notice. Not when I turned. Not when I walked away. Not even when I disappeared completely from his line of sight. The night air outside felt cooler than I expected, sharper somehow, as if the world beyond those glass doors operated on a different set of rules, one where things were clearer, quieter, more honest. I stepped onto the sidewalk and paused, not because I was unsure of where to go, but because I realized I had nowhere I needed to rush to. For years, my evenings had revolved around schedules, dinners, events, obligations that were never written down but always understood. And now, standing there alone, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Space. I wrapped my coat a little tighter around me and walked slowly toward the parking area, my heels clicking softly against the pavement, each step steady, deliberate, unhurried. Inside, the music continued, laughter spilling out each time the doors opened, but it already sounded distant, like something I had once been part of but no longer recognized. I reached my car and rested my hand on the door handle without opening it, my reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. For a long moment, I simply stood there, looking at the woman staring back at me, trying to reconcile who she had been with who she was becoming. I thought about the early years, when Richard would reach for my hand in crowded rooms, when introductions mattered, when my presence was not something to be managed or concealed, but something he valued. I remembered the small house we started in, the way we built everything piece by piece, decision by decision, never imagining that one day I would be standing outside an event that should have included me, realizing I had been quietly removed from the story we created together. A black sedan pulled up near the entrance behind me, and I heard the subtle shift in the atmosphere before I even turned around. Conversations softened. Movement slowed. The kind of attention that only follows someone important. I did not need to look to know who it was, but I did anyway, more out of habit than curiosity. The driver stepped out, opening the rear door with practiced precision, and a tall man in a tailored suit emerged, his presence commanding without effort. I recognized him immediately from photographs and company newsletters, though we had never met in person. Daniel Whitmore. The name carried weight in that building, in that company, in my husband's entire career. He paused just inside the entrance, speaking briefly to someone before his gaze moved across the area, scanning with a kind of quiet focus that suggested he was not simply looking, but searching. I turned slightly, intending to get into my car before drawing any unnecessary attention, but something in the way his expression changed made me hesitate. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Recognition. He took a step forward, then another, his attention fixed in my direction, and for a moment, I considered the possibility that he was looking past me, that there was someone else behind me who had caught his eye. I glanced over my shoulder. No one. When I turned back, he was already walking toward me, closing the distance with calm, purposeful strides, and as the noise from inside faded into a distant hum, I felt that same stillness return, not uncertainty, not fear, but something quieter, something steadier, like the beginning of an answer I had not yet fully understood. He stopped a few feet in front of me, close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that come from years of watching people carefully, not casually. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the quiet between us felt different from the silence inside the ballroom. It was not empty. It was deliberate. His gaze did not move away, did not hesitate, and I realized with a strange sense of clarity that he was not trying to place me. He already had. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice calm, certain, carrying just enough warmth to feel personal without becoming familiar. I felt the name settle in the air between us, heavier than it had felt all evening, as if it had been returned to me after being taken away. I did not correct him. I did not ask how he knew me. I simply met his eyes and inclined my head slightly, the way I had done countless times in rooms where introductions mattered. "I have been looking for you," he continued, and there was no performance in his tone, no attempt to impress, only a quiet urgency that made the words land differently than I expected. Behind him, I noticed movement near the entrance, a few people beginning to take interest, their conversations softening as they watched. I could feel the shift again, subtle but unmistakable, the way attention changes direction when something unexpected happens. "I think there may be some mistake," I said gently, not because I believed it, but because it was the response I had learned over years of navigating moments that did not quite make sense. He shook his head once, a small, decisive motion. "No, ma'am. There is no mistake." The way he said it left no room for doubt, and for the first time that evening, I felt something unfamiliar return. Not validation, not satisfaction, something steadier. Recognition. He glanced briefly, toward the ballroom, then back at me, as if confirming something he had already decided. "I was told you might be here tonight," he said, "but I was not given a name, only a description." There was a faint hint of something in his expression then, not quite a smile, but close. It turns out, that was enough. I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, the cool night air grounding me in a way the crowded room never could. "And what exactly were you looking for?" I asked, my voice even, measured, the same tone I had used for years when asking questions that required careful answers. He studied me for a moment, as if considering how much to say, then spoke with quiet precision. "Someone who built something important and was never credited for it." The words did not strike like a revelation. They settled, piece by piece, aligning with thoughts I had only begun to form earlier that evening. I did not look back toward the ballroom. I did not need to. Whatever was happening inside those walls had already lost its significance. "I see," I said softly, though I was not sure I fully did, not yet. He nodded slightly, as if that was enough for now. "If you are not in a hurry," he added, "I would appreciate a few minutes of your time." I glanced at my car, then back at him, weighing the simplicity of leaving against the quiet pull of understanding something I had not yet been given the chance to hear. For years, I had stayed in rooms where I was no longer seen. Tonight, for the first time, someone had stepped outside to find me, and without fully knowing why, I found myself stepping away from my car instead of toward it. We did not go far, only a few steps away from the entrance, just enough that the noise behind us softened into something distant and unimportant, like a conversation that no longer involved me. He gestured toward a quiet seating area near the side of the building, a small arrangement of chairs meant for brief conversations, not the kind that shift the course of a life, and yet something in the stillness of that moment suggested otherwise. I sat down slowly, smoothing my coat beneath me, more out of habit than necessity, and he remained standing for a second longer before taking the seat across from me, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if he understood the weight of what he was about to say. For a moment, he did not speak, and I appreciated that. Too many people rush to fill silence, afraid of what might surface if they do not. But he allowed it to exist, and in that pause, I felt my thoughts settle into something clearer. "Your husband joined the company 12 years ago," he began, his voice even, precise, not rehearsed but well considered. But the foundation he stepped into was already structured, efficient, thoughtful in ways that usually take years to develop. I listened without interrupting, my hands resting calmly in my lap, though I could feel the faint shift of something deeper beneath the surface. "I reviewed some of the early internal reports recently," he continued, "old planning documents, correspondence, strategy outlines. They were not signed in a way that made ownership obvious, but the voice behind them was consistent." He paused then, watching me carefully, not searching for a reaction, but confirming something he already believed. And that voice did not belong to him. The words did not surprise me as much as they might have years ago. Instead, they settled into place, aligning with memories I had long dismissed as ordinary contributions, small efforts made behind the scenes, the kind that did not require recognition because they were part of something shared. Late nights at the kitchen table, reviewing proposals he brought home, offering suggestions, rewriting sections, asking questions he had not considered. I had never thought of it as work. It had simply been part of our life. I did not come here tonight for the event, he said after a moment. I came because I wanted to confirm something before making a decision that will affect the future of this company. I met his gaze, steady, composed, though I could feel the significance of his words unfolding slowly, like a door opening to a room I had not known existed. And what decision would that be? I asked quietly. He leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, but certain. There is a position opening at the executive level, he said. One that requires not just experience, but perspective. The kind that comes from understanding how something is built from the ground up, not just how it appears once it is finished. I let the words settle before responding, not because I did not understand them, but because I needed to measure what they meant in the context of everything that had just happened. Inside, the music continued, laughter rising and falling, the same rhythm that had once included me without question. And now, here I was, sitting outside with a man who had stepped away from that room not to escape it, but to find me. You are asking me to return to something I was never officially part of, I said, my voice calm, reflective. No, he replied gently. I am asking you to step into something that has always been yours, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. I looked past him for a moment, not at the building, not at the people inside, but at the space beyond it, the quiet stretch of night that felt open, unclaimed. For years, I had adjusted myself to fit into smaller and smaller roles, convincing myself that it was enough, that it was appropriate, that it was expected. But sitting there, hearing my own story reflected back to me by someone who had no reason to diminish it, I felt something shift again, deeper this time. Not a reaction, not a defense, a realization. And for the first time that evening, I understood that leaving that room had not been the end of something. It had been the beginning of something I had not allowed myself to consider. He did not rush me for an answer, and that, more than anything, told me he understood the weight of what he was offering. Most people expect immediate responses when they believe they are presenting an opportunity, as if urgency proves its value. But he simply sat there, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. I rested my hands together, feeling the faint warmth return to my fingers after the cool night air, and let my thoughts move carefully, deliberately, the way I had learned to approach decisions that could not be undone. For years, I had operated in the background of someone else's story, shaping outcomes without claiming them, adjusting direction without attaching my name. And somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that was enough, that it was safer, that it preserved something worth keeping. But now, sitting across from a man who had taken the time to look beyond what was presented to him, I could no longer pretend that invisibility had been a choice made entirely on my own terms. If I were to consider this, I said slowly, choosing each word with care, it would not be about stepping into a role. It would be about understanding exactly what I am stepping into. He nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. Of course, he replied. And that is precisely why I wanted to speak with you before anything else was decided. He reached into his coat and pulled out a slim folder, not thick, not overwhelming, but substantial enough to suggest preparation rather than impulse. He placed it gently on the small table between us, but did not open it, leaving that choice to me. Everything I have found is in here, he said. Documents, internal notes, timelines. Not to convince you, but to show you what I see. I looked at the folder for a moment without touching it, aware that once I opened it, I would be looking at a version of my past that had been quietly recorded, analyzed, and preserved in ways I had never intended. For decades, my contributions had existed in conversations, in handwritten notes, in late-night discussions that ended with decisions someone else would present as their own. I had never needed proof. I had never asked for it. But now, here it was, offered not as validation, but as recognition. You understand, I said after a moment, that accepting something like this would change more than just my role. My voice remained steady, but there was a clarity in it now that had not been there before. It would change how everything that came before it is seen. He did not look away. Yes, he said simply. There was no hesitation in his answer, no attempt to soften the truth of it. And I believe that is long overdue. I let that settle, feeling its weight without resisting it. Inside the building, the evening continued without interruption. The same conversations, the same laughter, the same carefully maintained appearances. Richard would still be there, moving from one group to another, unaware of the conversation taking place just beyond the doors. Or perhaps not entirely unaware. Perhaps he had noticed my absence by now. The thought crossed my mind. Briefly, then passed. For the first time, it did not matter whether he had noticed or not. Why now? I asked quietly, not out of doubt, but out of a need to understand the timing of something that could have been discovered years earlier. He considered the question for a moment before answering. Because I was not the one in a position to see it before, he said. And now that I am, I do not intend to overlook it. There was something in that response that resonated more deeply than the offer itself. Not because it promised change, but because it acknowledged that change required someone willing to look differently at what had always been there. I reached forward then, placing my hand lightly on the folder, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, and for a moment, I simply rested there, aware of the quiet significance of that small movement. This was not about proving anything to anyone else. It was about deciding whether I was ready to stop diminishing my own place in the story I had helped build. I lifted my gaze back to his, steady, composed, no longer uncertain. Then I suppose, I said softly, it is time I take a closer look. I opened the folder slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it represented, the quiet accumulation of years I had never paused to measure. The pages inside were organized with a precision that felt almost unfamiliar to me. Dates aligned, notes cross-referenced, decisions traced back to their origins with a clarity I had never needed when those moments were simply part of my daily life. I scanned the first few lines, and immediately, I recognized the language, not word for word, but in structure, in rhythm, in the way the ideas unfolded. It was like hearing an echo of a conversation I had once had in a different room, at a different time, now preserved in ink. This proposal, I said quietly, glancing up for a moment before returning my attention to the page. This was never finalized like this. He watched me carefully, not interrupting, allowing me to move through the realization at my own pace. The original version had a different approach to the rollout. I continued, turning the page. It prioritized stability over speed. I paused, a faint, almost unnoticeable shift in my expression. As memory aligned with what I was reading, I suggested that adjustment. I added, more to myself than to him. He inclined his head slightly, as if confirming what he already knew. There are several instances like that, he said. I continued reading, each page revealing another piece of something I had once considered ordinary, each detail carefully documented in a way that transformed it from invisible effort into something tangible. Late-night revisions. Margin notes rewritten into formal language. Strategic changes that had shaped outcomes I had never claimed. I felt no sudden surge of pride, no overwhelming emotion, only a steady, grounding awareness that what I had done had not disappeared. It had simply been recorded without my presence attached to it. You have been very thorough, I said after a moment, closing the folder gently and resting my hand on top of it. I had to be, he replied. I do not make decisions based on assumptions. There was a quiet integrity in that statement that I recognized immediately, not because it was impressive, but because it was rare. I lifted my gaze again, meeting his eyes with a clarity that felt different from earlier in the evening, more defined, more certain. And you believe that what is in here is enough to justify what you are proposing. It was not a challenge, not exactly, but it was not acceptance either. He held my gaze without hesitation. I believe it is enough to begin the conversation, he said. The rest depends on whether you are willing to step into it. I let that settle, feeling the weight of the choice not as pressure, but as possibility. For years, I had adjusted myself to fit within boundaries that were never clearly defined, only implied. Now, for the first time, those boundaries felt less like limitations and more like something I could choose to leave behind. From inside the building, the doors opened briefly, a burst of light and sound spilling into the night, followed by a familiar voice calling out to someone near the entrance. I did not need to turn to recognize it. Richard. There was a slight urgency in his tone now, a subtle change from the effortless confidence he had carried earlier, and I wondered, not with concern but with curiosity, what he had noticed, what had shifted in his understanding of the evening. I remained where I was, my hand still resting on the folder, my posture unchanged. It seems, I said quietly, my voice steady, that I am no longer the only one who has begun to notice something is different. He followed my gaze briefly toward the entrance, then back to me, his expression thoughtful but composed. Then perhaps, he replied, it is the right time for them to understand it as well. I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition. Not everything needed to be explained immediately. Some realizations were more powerful when they arrived on their own. I lifted the folder again, holding it with a sense of ownership that had not been there moments before, and for the first time that evening, I felt not like someone who had been removed from a story, but like someone who had finally been handed the missing pages. I did not turn when I heard my name, not immediately, because for the first time that night, I understood that being called did not always mean being seen, and I was no longer willing to respond out of habit alone. The voice came again, closer now, sharper at the edges, carrying a trace of something I had not heard from him in a long time. Not authority, not confidence, something closer to uncertainty. Margaret. I let a breath pass before I moved, then slowly shifted my gaze toward the entrance. He was standing just beyond the doors, scanning the space as if trying to correct a mistake he had only just realized had been made. The woman who had been at his side earlier was no longer there, and for a brief moment, he looked out of place. It was a subtle change, one that most people would not notice, but I had spent decades reading the smallest shifts in his posture, his tone, the way he held himself when something was no longer under his control. I remained seated, the folder resting calmly in my hands, not hidden, not displayed, simply present. He stepped toward us, his pace measured but purposeful, his attention fixed on me now in a way it had not been all evening. When he reached us, he stopped, his eyes flicking briefly to Daniel before returning to me, as if trying to understand a situation he had not been prepared for. There you are, he said, his voice softer now, almost careful. I have been looking for you. The words echoed faintly, not because of what they meant, but because of how easily they could have been spoken earlier, inside, when it would have mattered in a different way. I met his gaze without standing, without adjusting my posture, without offering the small gestures that had once smoothed over moments like this. Have you? I asked quietly. It was not a challenge. It was not an accusation. It was simply a question, and for a moment, he did not answer. His attention shifted again, this time more directly toward Daniel, recognition settling into his expression as he straightened slightly. Mr. Whitmore, he said, the name carrying its usual respect, though there was a hint of tension beneath it now. I did not realize you had arrived. Daniel inclined his head slightly, his composure unchanged. I arrived a few minutes ago, he replied. I stepped outside to speak with your wife. There was a pause then, brief but unmistakable, the kind that reveals more than any immediate response could. I watched it pass between them, the shift in understanding, the recalibration of roles, of expectations. Richard's gaze returned to me, lingering just a moment longer than before, as if seeing something he had overlooked earlier, something that had not changed, but had been ignored. You could have told me you were stepping out, he said, his tone controlled, but not entirely steady. I considered that for a moment, not because I needed to, but because it deserved an answer that was as measured as everything else I had said that evening. I did not think it would be noticed, I replied. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment, not with bitterness, not with accusation, but with a clarity that did not require emphasis. He did not respond immediately, and in that silence, I saw it, the recognition he had not expected to face, not here, not like this. I shifted my attention back to Daniel then, not to dismiss Richard, but because the conversation I had stepped into carried a different kind of significance now. We were discussing something important, I said calmly. Something that may require a bit more time. Daniel nodded slightly, his gaze steady. Of course. I rose then, smoothing my coat with the same quiet precision I had carried all evening. But this time, the movement felt different, not like an attempt to maintain composure, but like a reflection of it. I did not look back toward the ballroom. I did not ask to return. Instead, I stood between the two men, no longer positioned at the edge of something, but at the center of a moment neither of them had fully anticipated. And for the first time that night, I understood that being seen was not something that could be granted or withheld by someone else. It was something I could choose to claim. I did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because for the first time, it was not uncomfortable, it was necessary, and I could feel both of them adjusting to it in their own ways, one recalculating, the other simply observing. Richard shifted his weight slightly, his gaze moving between me and the folder in my hands, and I could see the question forming before he spoke it, not yet shaped into words, but already carrying concern. "What is this about?" he asked finally, his voice measured, but no longer as certain as it had been earlier that evening. I looked down at the folder briefly, then back at him, not with hesitation, but with a clarity that no longer required explanation beyond what was already visible. "It is about something that has been here longer than either of us chose to acknowledge," I said calmly. He frowned slightly, as if trying to place my words within a context that made sense to him, one that preserved the structure he had been operating within for years. "Margaret," he began, lowering his voice, taking a small step closer as if proximity might restore familiarity. "If this is about tonight, we can talk about it later. You do not need to stand out here." I listened to him without interruption, noting not just what he said, but how he said it, the instinct to move the conversation away, to contain it, to return things to a setting where he understood the dynamics. I shook my head once, gently, not dismissing him, but redirecting the moment. "This is not about tonight," I replied. "Tonight simply made something visible that has been there for a long time." Daniel remained silent beside us, his presence steady, not intrusive, allowing the exchange to unfold without interference, and I was aware of how unusual that was, how rare it is for someone with power to step back rather than take control. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to realization, the kind that arrives slowly, piece by piece, resisting at first, then settling in whether it is welcomed or not. "I do not understand what you are saying," he said, though the words sounded less like a statement and more like a pause before one. I held his gaze, not to challenge him, but to meet him where he was, without stepping back into the role he expected. "For years," I said quietly, "I stood beside you, not behind you, not apart from you, but beside you. And somewhere along the way, that position changed, not all at once, not in a way that could be pointed to, but in small decisions, small omissions, small adjustments that made it easier for me to disappear without anyone needing to say it out loud." He did not interrupt this time. He did not correct me. He simply listened, and I could see the difference, the shift from speaking to understanding, even if it was incomplete. I continued, my voice steady, not rising, not breaking. "Tonight, you introduced an entire room to a version of your life that did not include me. Not because I was not there, but because it was more convenient if I was not seen." The words settled between us, not heavy, not sharp, just clear. I glanced briefly toward the ballroom, then back to him. "And now," I added, lifting the folder slightly, not as evidence, but as acknowledgement, "someone else has taken the time to see what was always there." Richard's eyes moved to the folder again, and for a moment, something unspoken passed through his expression, something that looked very much like understanding, though it had not yet fully formed. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. I let a small breath pass, not out of exhaustion, but out of completion, as if the thought had finally reached its natural end. "I am saying," I replied, "that I am no longer willing to be part of a story where I am only present when it is convenient." The night remained still around us, the sounds from inside continuing as they had before, unchanged, uninterrupted, and yet everything in that moment felt different, not because something had been taken away, but because something had finally been named. I adjusted my coat slightly, holding the folder with a sense of calm ownership, and met his gaze one last time, not with distance, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to be reinforced. "And I think," I added softly, "this is where that story begins to change."